All right, so I had three things for my Taunar. One of the biggest issues that I had to deal with was the torso section. So this upper area lined up with these really, really well, but then would not line up with this back section. I could either have these two line up with the back or these two line up with the front. So I made it to where they lined up with the front really, really well, since that's where our eyes are going to be. To solve the problem, I had to use a heat gun very, very carefully on some of the parts in order to get them to bend and form the way I wanted them to. You can also use really, really hot water. You just have to, be careful about that. But that's how I had to deal with that. I still, though, had gaps between some of my seams, so I had to use an expanding glue like this one. It kind of foams and expands out to help fill spaces. It's not as strong as other glues when you have both sides pushed together, but it does help when you have a gap between it to at least hold it in place to secure it a little bit later. So if I spin around the back, of the Taunar, right in here, it's hard to see on camera, which is good. I don't actually want anybody to see that, which is why it's also black. But you can see how it's actually pulled and separated away from the pieces a little bit. And that's exactly what you're seeing is some of that filler, that expanding glue that's popping up right there in that center section. So it's a good thing we can't see it. That's why I chose to make it black. So that's one of the big things that I had was these pieces were really, really far away from each other. Two more things with the Taunar. One, I chose to do a dynamic pose, so that made my legs harder to work with. I didn't like the way that it looked when it was just standing. I don't just standing. So I did this kind of hip flex situation, which I also wanted my Taunar to lean forward slightly because of the big guns on the back. I knew it was going to add a lot of weight to pull it back, and indeed it does. So I had to pin it. I also had to deal with a situation with down here, which brings me to number two, the legs. So I had to use some of that expanding glue down in here, which is really hard to see when you're not looking for it and you don't know it exists, but it's there. I didn't have to do so much here, but I did do some pinning in the hips all the way through here. And I did actually pin back through here this thruster, this little engine port. I actually pinned it all the way through here because every single one of these spots is a hinge point for your Taunar to fail and fall upon itself. It looks gorgeous, but it's kind of horrible if you're trying to go for a dynamic design. So that's number two. Number one, again, the torso. Number two are how the legs. I highly recommend you pin it. Those are clever ways to hide it through the thrusters or even up through the ball and into the ankle section. The last one, I have to kind of pull some pieces apart in order to get to. But I magnetized these. I just stuck a magnet right there, and there's a magnet underneath the torso. This whole section comes apart. These actually slide off. Sorry, I didn't show that. These actually slide off completely. There's no magnet. There's nothing there. They just hold it pretty well. This is a pin system. There are spots for magnets, but I just used a pin. Whoop. In fact, that's a piece of wood pin. It's not even a metal one. And I did the same thing on the other arm. These is pinned in there as well, so I could take it off if I wanted to. And I did that for travel. Anyway, this is the third thing that I ran into with the Taunar is the hip. So this is essentially a really oval. It's a big ball joint. So it has a ball joint here on the bottom, has a ball joint on the top. So I had to pin into the hip flexing area up into this. And I had to test that so many times to get this to go straight up and down so that the mass of the body steps evenly between the two legs. So that one was really, really important. Once I got that one figured out, I locked it in and I was like, we're just running with it and we have to figure our lives out otherwise. And then I chose a slightly larger pin for this one. So you can see that I have a really big opening there. And in this one down here, I probably drilled 2 or 3 or 4 different holes to get the placement just right. So to recap, the torso was a big problem because it was separating. All the pieces were slightly off. The legs, due to the way that I rotated the hips and made a more dynamic pose, I had to do some pinning up through the legs. I had to pin from the hips into to the center section. And the third thing that I had to deal with was because of the double ball joint that's here, I did this one first to get it. I did that one first on top to get it straight up and down, and then I adapted the bottom one based upon how I did the first one. As I mentioned, I only have one drill in here, but I had multiple drills on the bottom. So now that I've mentioned that, hopefully those are some things that you don't ever have to deal with. Oh well. And I will do another kind of 360 turn, even though he's missing. Just as a little nugget, I actually had a steel ball, so I put a magnet in his head for funsies. So there's my Taunar missing his arm. Wonderful.